What if I were to tell you that Dr. Hannibal Lecter isn't actually a psychopath? We all know the monster in The Silence of the Lambs.
Good evening, Clarice.
Despite only having 16 minutes of screen time, Hannibal remains the monstrous being society remembers. Hannibal Lecter is one of my favorite characters, but I truly don't believe that he is a psychopath, to the contrary of popular belief.
Pure psychopath. So rare to capture one alive.
We will examine whether he is a psychopath from various perspectives, including diagnostic criteria, his childhood, and how these factors influence his character. We will also analyze the differences and inconsistencies in his representation through multiple media he is within. Hopefully, this analysis will help us understand why Hannibal is called a psychopath and why he isn't actually a good representation of an individual with psychopathy. Dr. Lecter has been a very popular character within media, even being talked about in other movies and shows that have nothing to do with him. Hannibal's grasp on mainstream media began with the 1991 film The Silence of the Lambs, directed by Jonathan Demme. But his story actually begins 10 years earlier. Former crime journalist Thomas Harris would write his second novel, Red Dragon, which is the first introduction of Hannibal Lecter. This would be the first of two procedural-style crime novels, the second being Silence of the Lambs. Hannibal would technically be a main character or a protagonist, even though only having approximately 16 minutes of screen time in The Silence of the Lambs. Harris would ultimately write 4 books in the series, with Hannibal having more of an integral role in the last 2. Within the novels, Hannibal can be described as a sleek and wiry man with slicked black hair and small white teeth. He also has a form of polydactyly in which he has a 6th finger on his left hand. His physical appearance stays pretty consistent throughout the multi of media he is in, going from Brian Cox in Manhunter to Anthony Hopkins in Silence, Red Dragon, and Hannibal, even Gaspard Ulliel in Hannibal Rising, and Mads Mikkelsen in the TV series Hannibal. The thing that does change, though, is his behaviors and personality traits. Before I move on, I do want to preface that I will not be talking about Brian Cox's portrayal as Hannibal Lecter, nor will I be talking about Manhunter. I wouldn't think it would be fair to talk about it as I haven't watched the movie. First, I do want to preface that I am not a psychologist, nor do I have any formal education in psychology. I have taken my time to do as much research as possible to understand the criterias under psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, but I am not a professional. I just want to compare this criteria that I have done my research on to a very basic level to understand the type of character that Hannibal Lecter is. And also, please never take any of this information from this video or any research that you plan on doing yourself and trying to diagnose other people. That is not your job. That is the job of a professional. Please do not diagnose people in real life. First, I do want to talk about the differences between antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. ASPD is a clinical disorder diagnosed under the guidelines of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, also known as the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is the overall umbrella guideline to diagnose almost every mental disorder we know today. ASPD is a cluster B disorder. It also includes disorders such as narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, to name a few. Some symptoms that I can name that apply to antisocial personality disorder include violation of social norms, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability and aggression, and a disregard for safety, responsibility, and lastly, a lack of remorse. Although most of the time, not all of these traits are applicable to somebody with this disorder. Also, to be able to be diagnosed with this disorder, there is some other criteria that need to be met, including having a history of a conduct disorder when you were a child or a teen. And you also have to be over the age of 18. Now let's talk about psychopathy. Psychopathy actually isn't a diagnosable condition or disorder. It is not in the DSM-5. Rather, it is used in a forensic setting. Those being diagnosed with psychopathy have already been or are currently in prison. To find out if somebody is a psychopath, they use something called the Hare's Psychopathic Checklist, also known as the PCLR. 2 factors are used when using the checklist, which can be split into 2 sub-factors. Factor 1 is interpersonal and affect, and the second factor is social deviance. Factoring within the interpersonal traits includes traits like superficial charm, grandiosity, pathological lying, and manipulation. Within the affective part, there are traits of lack of remorse, shallow affect, callousness or lack of empathy, and a lack of taking responsibility for actions. In the second factor, the first sub-factor is lifestyle, which can lead to traits like a need for stimulation, a parasitic lifestyle, a lack of remorse, impulsivity, and irresponsibility. The last sub-factor is antisocial, which would have poor behavioral controls, early behavioral problems, juvenile delinquency, revocation of conditional release, and criminal versatility. ASPD actually fits within the factor 2 traits of psychopathy, but not factor 1. Based on these understandings, I have come up with 2 categories of Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal Lecter in the movies and the books because they live in the same vein as each other. And then the next category is Hannibal in the show because I see a very different understanding of behavior with Mads Mikkelsen's portrayal in the series versus Anthony Hopkins in the films. What I have done is I have filled out the PCLR for both of these categories. First being the books and movies, and then the second being Hannibal in the show. I used references from other people that have done research on similar things to be able to fill out this checklist, and ultimately I have come up with my results. First, let's understand more of the criteria of what the PCLR is. The PCLR consists of 20 questions or criteria. The highest that you can score is a 40 on the PCLR, being that you score 2 points for each criteria. So you can score from a 0 to a 2 for each criteria. 0 being not present, 1 being somewhat present, and 2 being definitely present. My results for Hannibal in the books and movies is a 14. That isn't even close to the minimum score that you need to have in order to be considered a psychopath. In North America, the lowest score that you can get while still being considered a psychopath is a 30. And in the UK, it's a score of 25. So a 14 isn't close to either. And then Hannibal Lecter in the show scored a 19. Still not a psychopath technically, but closer to the UK standards, but still not a psychopath technically. First, I want to deep dive into Hannibal in the films and books, starting with the interpersonal category. Hannibal Lecter is a man of class by all means. He is always well dressed, very trained musically, listens to classical music, plays exotic instruments. He also is well versed in cooking, which ultimately leads to him holding very extravagant dinner parties for people and feeding them human. Or should I say long pig? Hannibal truly represents the superficial charm and grandiosity of the interpersonal category with his lifestyle. His physical representation almost makes him feel trustworthy on a very surface level, but it is a constant act of manipulation. The factor, though, that doesn't fit his character is pathological lying. He doesn't lie just because. He only lies when he needs to, which isn't that often. He is usually very honest, but a lot of the time his honesty comes through a lot of riddles and tricks that other people have to decode. It is all in order to get into people's heads. And before he even gives you those riddles, he's asking for information from you, creating a quid pro quo dynamic. The next factor is affect, which isn't very applicable to his character. He is in full control of all of his emotions. It's almost like he has a control panel in his brain. Think about Riley from Inside Out. But instead of having emotions actually controlling the panel, he has killed those emotions and taken over himself. Some of these emotions include empathy, remorse, callousness, and responsibility. Those are the main ones that he has the most control over. He, though, doesn't have a shallow affect because he is a very well-respected person. He doesn't come across to people as somebody that would make them uncomfortable. He masks well enough to show that he can have basic human emotion. Just because he has control of learned social emotions, like empathy and remorse, doesn't mean that he doesn't have them at all. I truly believe that he does have empathy and remorse for certain people, especially people that show him common courtesy and respect, including somebody like Clarice Starling. Hannibal is a very well-mannered man and very level-headed. He can be callous towards people, really only towards his victims and people such as Dr. Frederick Chilton, who he believes is his enemy. He also takes responsibility for almost all of his actions in almost a prideful way. He is very proud of his actions of murder and deception. An example of him being proud of himself and taking responsibility for his actions is when he tells Clarice about what he did to the census taker that tried to test him. The last two factors are lifestyle and antisocialness. The only categories that really fit his character are the need for stimulation and criminal versatility. Though you can say that juvenile delinquency and early behavioral problems do fit, but that would ultimately be changed in the canon material after Hannibal Rising was written. The factor fitting best is the need for stimulation. He is constantly surrounding himself in any sort of stimulation he can. Like I have said, music, cooking, drawing. Drawing was especially important to him and his need for stimulation after his incarceration. Hannibal doesn't rely on other people to get what he wants, which really shows that he has nothing to do with any sort of parasitic lifestyle. If he wants something, he will get it. He has done that for himself so well that even after his incarceration, he is still a respected psychiatrist, being able to still publish work into any psychiatric journal he wants. Hannibal Lecter in the films and books is an almost monstrous being, something that has never existed, having abilities that just don't seem right. This includes his sense of smell, his intelligence, his aesthetic ideals. Everything seems to be out of place. Due to the fact that his character can never exist, it makes sense that most of the criteria is not applicable. That is one reason why I can't say with any sort of serious thought that Hannibal Lecter is actually a psychopath. Within the movies and the books, he is a monster. That is the only way you can describe him. Even though, in the actual media itself, he is described as a psychopath. But I truly believe it's wrong. A man like Hannibal Lecter cannot exist. But that is really what changes with Hannibal in the show. Because I believe he is somebody that could actually exist. Yes, in a very exaggerated way, because it is still a TV show, and TV shows are always elevated media to be entertaining. But his representation is way more realistic. Within the interpersonal category, Hannibal in the show stays pretty consistent, other than his capacity to lie. I truly believe that he still isn't a pathological liar, but he does seem to lie more just to see what would happen. He also seems to manipulate people a little bit more. He uses manipulation to make friends, truly because I think he doesn't know any other way to make meaningful relationships and friendships. Within the affective category, I do believe that Hannibal stays pretty similar to the latter media, but I do think he has a little bit less control over his emotions. And he also struggles sometimes to mask, which can be explained through many scenes in the show. Not to say that Hannibal in the books or movies doesn't make people uncomfortable or lack a mask sometimes, but he still is very good and well fleshed out in showing a mask that has no cracks. One scene in the show that really sticks out to me, where Hannibal really drops his mask for a second, is after Will had coughed up Abigail's ear. Hannibal himself had placed the ear in Will's throat. Hannibal is trying to act distraught and upset over what has happened to his friend, but he's almost overdoing it. He is almost taking what he has observed from other people to try to create a believable reaction. That is just one of many examples in the series where Hannibal somewhat drops his mask. And it can also be described, yes, in the show, he has a very well-tailored person suit. But I don't fully believe that there's a monster that lives under that person's suit. I think it's a flawed human that doesn't understand those learned social emotions. It can also be said that Hannibal in the show doesn't take as much responsibility for his actions, or at least doesn't always think through the consequences of his actions. One of the quotes that he says multiple times throughout the show is, "I wanted to see what would happen." That is the ultimate not taking responsibility and having some sort of impulsivity. Within lifestyle and antisocial, the one thing that really does change is impulsivity. Again, really cementing in the fact that he doesn't always think about his actions and the consequences that come with them. He especially doesn't think about the consequences of his actions when it comes to Will Graham. I truly believe that that comes from the fact that he really loves Will, and that love almost drowns out any sort of logic that he would normally use. This love for Will is something that he hasn't really felt, at least since his sister was alive when he was a child. So I think that really clouds any sort of judgment. Another thing that I do want to talk about is that one of the questions in the PCLR is sexual promiscuity, which isn't really applicable at all for Hannibal in the books and the movies. But it is very applicable for Hannibal in the show, as he is seen as having an affair with Alana Bloom, and Alana herself even has a line where she's talking about how when she was doing her fellowship with Hannibal, Hannibal was having multiple affairs. He has never been married though, but still he's clearly had many sexual partners. I also want to talk about Hannibal's childhood. All of this information is coming from Hannibal Rising. Hannibal Rising came out almost 30 years after Red Dragon came out. Thomas Harris wasn't actually planning on writing that novel, but after being told that there was going to be an origin story adapted for another movie going to be made, whether he wrote another novel or not, he decided to take control of his character again and write Hannibal Rising. Though clearly it still shows that he didn't want to write this or have any plan on writing this, because he changed canon material that we had on Hannibal Lecter as a child. In Red Dragon, it is said that Hannibal had a penchant for animal cruelty as a child. Well, guess what? There is no evidence of that in Hannibal Rising. Hannibal was a pretty normal kid, despite just being very intelligent. Growing up in Lithuania in a castle called Castle Lecter, his father and mother were a count and countess. Hannibal Rising begins during World War II. Them living in Lithuania gives the issues of the Nazis were at large, but also the Soviet occupation was at large. Ultimately, this war and brutality would make it to Hannibal's home. His family would hide in a cottage that was in the woods away from their castle, but they would ultimately be found. Hannibal would watch his parents and family members be killed, the only surviving being himself and his little sister Misha. They would be held captive for days, locked up in chains. After many days, Misha would start showing that she was really sick. From the cold, from not being fed properly. So all these men would take Misha outside while she was screaming for Hannibal. And they would murder her. They wouldn't just murder her. They would cannibalize her body because they were running out of food. They even fed Hannibal. And it took him a few days to learn what had actually happened. Hannibal later would ultimately escape from his captivity and he would be found and put into an orphanage. The orphanage in which was being run in his family's castle. Think about that for a second. He was in an orphanage, but he was living in his family home. Due to all this trauma, he would become selectively mute. And it would take many years, him going into teenagehood, for him to be found by a family member. He would be taken in by his uncle Robertus, and he would move to France. Though his uncle would die very soon after that, meaning that Hannibal's only caretaker would be his uncle's wife, Lady Marasaki. He has a pretty good life there, but as he learns more about what happened to his sister, he wants to get revenge. He starts going to medical school, and he's one of the youngest people to ever go to medical school in Europe at that point. And he would use his medical knowledge to help him when he was hunting down all of his captors and the men that murdered his sister. He would kill all of them. This would create a never-ending cycle for Hannibal Lecter. This origin story is very, very over the top. When I read the book and then watched the movie, I really felt bad for him. And that was a weird feeling to have because, of course, we know the person, the monster that Hannibal became. But the major problem that I have with this origin story is it doesn't fit with what has been shown with his character in the books before, which is why I love the series. I really felt like Brian Fuller took all of the information and created a very comprehensive character that all of this canon material fit so well. I also want to say that with this comprehensive character built of Hannibal Lecter in the show, there is an almost delusional factor of it. We can see that due to the revenge that he was getting on his sister, that created a delusion, which ultimately created that cycle that wouldn't stop. Next being him bringing him to Italy, specifically Florence. As a young man, he would start killing in a very, very different way. He would be known as Il Mostro, or the Monster of Florence. He would murder people and display them in ways that represented famous art pieces. He was also, during this, still going through medical school. And then he would ultimately get an offer for a fellowship at Johns Hopkins, which is in Baltimore, Maryland. That is what brought him to America. And that is where he ultimately became the Chesapeake Ripper. His body count is too large to actually make a full comprehensive list. But clearly that delusion that was created after he got revenge on his sister, it couldn't be stopped. Because of this delusion and some of the traits that I felt were different in the show than in the books, I feel like Hannibal represents more of somebody that has antisocial personality disorder. That shallow affect really plays into that. And also, it can really be shown that he really connects with Will to the degree that Will himself is also a neurodivergent. Not the same as Hannibal, but they still can empathize with each other. I don't want to discount that what Hannibal does is bad. But the thing that the series does is gives him humanity, shows that he suffers from the same human condition that all of us do. He literally just can't stop himself from killing. It is a cycle that he built onto himself and there is no stopping him. So many of the issues seen that Hannibal faces in the show is something that many of us in real life have faced as well. And I don't want to say that, like, he's similar to any of us that are neurodivergent, but he is way more realistic. And I also want to say another thing that probably plays into Hannibal the show being a better representation and more of a realistic representation is because it is a more modern adaptation. Hannibal Lecter was first written in the early 80s. There was a very different understanding of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. But ultimately, that allowed Brian Fuller to create a modernized version of Hannibal Lecter, which ultimately has been a character that I could talk for hours about. That is why I say I love Hannibal Lecter. And some may call me crazy, or say some fucked up shit to me. But I promise nothing can hurt my feelings anymore. People have broken down those barriers already. I remember one time, my so-called best friend said to me, I remember basically word for word. She's like, Rowan, when you grow up, you're gonna become a serial killer because you love horror. I just find it funny now because I probably have way more empathy and compassion and remorse than people like them. Because if you have the balls to say that to somebody, then you lack any sort of compassion, empathy, or respect and kindness for somebody. So I promise you, I'm probably actually a lot better of a person than a lot of people. I want people that have interests like me to feel safe here, because I know that we face so much cruelty in the real world, and people that just don't want to understand. I know I'm weird, but I'm proud, and that's why I made this channel. This will probably not even be close to my last video talking about Hannibal Lecter. I also want to make a video talking about Will Graham, but I might do a few more videos in between just to create some variety, but expect that to come in the near future. Well, I hope that any of you watching this enjoyed it. And I'm still trying to figure out how I'm gonna do these types of videos. And I wrote an entire script for this, and I did follow it, but I also decided to kind of talk about what I wanted to talk about as well. But I enjoyed the whole process of making this, and I hope you guys will love it too, because I want at least somebody to get something out of this. I also want to give credit to the people that I got information from. It will all be linked in my bio. And honestly, some of it was so interesting to read that I really recommend you go into my description and read it. It was so good. Some of them I read, I think, 10 times. It was so good. Well, please consider liking and subscribing, and even checking out some of my other social medias. They're all going to be linked in my description, and they're also linked in my bio. Anyways, bye guys.